The stench arrived before he did. 3 rooms ahead, it warned everyone of his presence. When the bloated and motionless figure of Henry VIII moved through the palace corridors, it wasn't the sound of footsteps that announced him, it was the smell of rotting flesh, pus, and death. They said even the royal hounds, trained for the horrors of war, recoiled when he drew near. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't the smell. It's the contrast. Because this man, this decaying body barely able to breathe, this paranoid tyrant surrounded by flatterers holding perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses, was once the most admired prince in all of Europe. A charismatic youth, athletic, talented, seductive. A king who enchanted diplomats and made other rulers bow as if he were a demigod. This is the story of the downfall of a man who believed himself greater than any law, any church, even death itself. And who paid a grotesque price for it. Henry was born into splendor. His birth in 1491 was celebrated as the dawn of renewal. At just 17, crowned King of England, he was described as a golden giant, flaming red hair, the build of a knight, piercing eyes, flawless skin. A Venetian ambassador wrote that he had never seen a prince so radiant and graceful. And it wasn't just his looks, it was the charisma, the wit, the magnetism. He spoke multiple languages, composed music, debated theology, hunted with precision, and danced with unmatched elegance. He was, in every sense, the embodiment of the Renaissance ideal, but brilliance, when too intense, doesn't just illuminate, it blinds. And it was precisely at the height of his power that fate began to script his fall. In January of 1536, during a jousting tournament in Greenwich, the king rode one of his fiercest war horses. It was a spectacle. Armors gleamed, the crowd roared. Drums pounded like hearts racing. And then disaster. The horse stumbled, collapsed, and crushed the king beneath it. Henry was unconscious for 2 hours. When he awoke, he was alive, but he would never be the same again. At the time, it was said that he only suffered a leg wound, but some modern historians believe he may have also sustained a traumatic brain injury. One way or another, the truth is this: the man who rose from that accident carried not only an open wound on his leg, one that would never heal, but a darkness inside him that began to grow from that moment on. The king's body became a battlefield, and his mind, once sharp, curious, and politically cunning, slowly began to fracture. The leg wound, deep and jagged, refused to close. It festered, bled, and eventually transformed into a chronic ulcer. Physicians tried every known remedy of the time: poultices, heated irons, and mixtures containing mercury and arsenic. They cauterized it, drained it, wrapped it in cloth soaked with herbs, but nothing worked. Over time, the leg began to rot. The flesh turned black, the smell became unbearable, and the king, once a symbol of health and power, became something monstrous. Servants whispered that you could smell him coming long before you saw him. And yet, no one dared react. To flinch, to gag, even to blink, to fast in his presence, could be seen as treason. The palace became a stage of forced smiles and hidden revulsion. The physical pain Henry endured was unimaginable. But what made it worse, what twisted it into something crueler, was his growing inability to accept what he had become. He was vain, always had been. Even as his waistline exploded past 50 inches, even when his legs could no longer support his weight without assistance, even when doorways had to be widened and pulleys installed to move him between chambers, he demanded to be seen as majestic. He wore elaborate robes and jewels. He insisted on portraits that flattered him. But mirrors could be covered. Paintings could lie. What he couldn't hide was the smell, or the way people looked away when he passed, and then came the rage. Maybe it was the head injury. Maybe it was the isolation. Or maybe it was the slow realization that even a king cannot defeat decay. Whatever the cause, Henry's temperament began to shift violently. He grew paranoid, suspicious of everyone around him. Long-time advisors were suddenly executed without trial. Friends vanished overnight. The court lived in constant fear, afraid to speak, to look, to breathe wrong in his presence. He accused his second wife, Anne Boleyn, of adultery, incest, and treason, charges widely believed to be fabricated. She was beheaded. He replaced her with Jane Seymour, who gave him a son, but died shortly after childbirth. The cycle repeated: obsession, disappointment, execution. As his body broke down, so did his relationships. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, a teenage girl full of life and curiosity, could barely bring herself to touch him. Their marriage was a grotesque mismatch: an old, diseased man and a vibrant young woman. She sought affection elsewhere. When her affair was discovered, Henry ordered her execution too. By his sixth marriage, to Catherine Parr, he no longer sought companionship. He sought care. She was less a queen than a nurse, tending to his wounds, enduring his moods, keeping up the appearance of royalty in a house that reeked of dying flesh. Henry consumed over 5,000 calories a day, mostly meats, pies, and heavy ale. Vegetables were for the poor. He stuffed himself, unable or unwilling to move, growing larger, more immobile, more trapped in his own grotesque form. His gout worsened. His joints swelled. His face puffed into a permanent scowl. Every breath was labored. Every step a negotiation with pain. And yet, despite everything, he clung to power. He issued decrees. He signed executions. He barked orders. From a bed soaked in pus and sweat, he was still king, still feared, still obeyed, but no longer loved. In his final years, the air inside the royal chambers thickened not just with the unbearable stench of decay, but with tension so sharp it could silence a room with a glance. The courtiers walked on metaphorical eggshells, terrified that a single misinterpreted gesture might provoke the king's wrath. One wrong word could mean imprisonment. One misstep, a beheading. And so they smiled, bowed, whispered lies of admiration, while secretly praying they would make it through the day unnoticed. The palace had become a place of fear, a golden prison ruled by a man imprisoned in his own body. The paranoia took over completely. Henry no longer trusted anyone. He feared. Plots, poisons, shadows. Meals were tasted by servants before reaching his lips. Utensils were inspected. Even the wine was scrutinized. He became obsessed with betrayal, convinced that death would not come naturally, but would be placed in his cup by the hands of someone close. This fear led to the execution of more advisors, more nobles, more perceived enemies, none more symbolic than Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, whose blood stained the Tower of London just 9 days before the king's own death. And then death did come, but not with dignity, not with silence. It came slowly, dragging itself across his body like a punishment, refusing to offer him the release he might have once begged God for. By the winter of 1546, Henry was nothing more than a massive mound of swollen flesh. His legs infected beyond. Saving had turned dark green from gangrene. The ulcers, those gaping holes that had festered for years, now oozed fluids constantly. Fevers racked his body. Delirium set in. He would scream for hours, curse the people around him, then fall into silence so deep it was as if life had already left him. In those moments of silence, when his chest barely rose, those closest to him whispered of ghosts. They said he murmured the names of his wives Jane, Anne, even Catherine. Some believed he saw their faces in the corners of the room, watching him. Others claimed he spoke to them, apologized, begged, wept. It is impossible to know if these were hallucinations or the stirrings of a guilty conscience. But what is certain is that even then, even when death was licking at his heels, no one dared say he was dying. In England, it was treason to predict the monarch's death. So doctors lied, advisors reassured. And while the king's body quite literally began to rot while still alive, the court kept pretending he would recover. The end came quietly. On the night of January 27, 1547, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was called to the king's bedside. Henry could no longer speak. When asked if he died in the Christian faith, he merely squeezed the archbishop's hand. It was his final gesture. The following morning, the king, who had defied the pope, executed his wives, rewritten the laws of England, and terrorized a nation for decades, exhaled one last, rattling breath. He was 55, and yet, even in death, there was no rest. His body was so swollen, so misshapen, that a special coffin had to be built, an enormous wooden box reinforced with iron to hold the weight of a man who, by then, no longer resembled a king. The embalmers were horrified. In a time when preservation meant little more than removing the internal organs and stuffing the cavities with aromatic herbs, Henry's corpse posed a dreadful challenge. The decay had already set in deeply. His skin already ruptured in places, leaked fluids. The smell, no longer human, was described in letters as monstrous, unbearable, a punishment from God. They washed him as best they could, anointed the body with thick layers of balm and resin, and sealed the coffin shut, or at least, they tried, placed in the chapel at Sion Abbey to await the state funeral. The coffin began to groan under the pressure of gases building inside. Then came the leakage. Royal attendants discovered a dark, viscous fluid seeping through the cracks. By morning, a grotesque scene awaited them. Stray dogs had entered the chapel and were licking the pooled liquid on the floor, fluids that had escaped from the body of the King of England. Chroniclers of the time, even those loyal to the Tudors, could not hide their horror. The symbolism was devastating. A monarch who had ruled through fear, who had styled himself as God's chosen on earth, was now leaking like meat left too long in the sun. His dignity devoured by mongrels, but the show had to go on. On February 16th, 1547, almost 3 weeks after his death, the funeral was held. It was a lavish spectacle. Trumpets, banners, black velvet, the full machinery of Tudor ceremony. The court processed in silence, surrounded by incense so thick it clung to their hair and robes. Not to honor the dead, but to mask the smell. The king was interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a legitimate son, Edward VIII. The boy, so fragile in health, and yet so crucial to Henry's legacy, would sit on the throne for only 6 years before dying at age 15. The very future Henry had fought, bled, and killed to secure crumbled within a decade, and then came the ultimate irony. After Edward, the throne passed not to another male heir, but to the daughters Henry had tried so desperately to control. Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, would attempt to reverse the Protestant reforms and return England to Catholicism through fire and blood. And Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the wife Henry had executed under false charges, would become the longest reigning Tudor monarch and usher in what many call the Golden Age of England. Henry's physical death was grotesque. But his symbolic death, the collapse of the image he had so carefully crafted, was perhaps even more profound. The man who once believed himself above all others, who saw himself as the embodiment of strength and divine authority, died screaming, stinking, melting into the mattress of his royal bed. The power he had wielded so mercilessly could not shield him from the simplest truth of all. The body decays. The mind fails. And even kings rot, and yet, in the grand tapestry of history, we often remember the crown more than the man beneath it. Portraits of Henry VIII still hang in museums and textbooks, showing a broad-shouldered, defiant ruler with eyes full of pride and certainty. But those images lie. They are curated illusions, designed to intimidate, to inspire loyalty, to immortalize power. They do not show the ulcers, the trembling hands, the sleepless nights filled with groans and whispers. They do not show the stink of rotting flesh or the haunting look in the eyes of those who dared to serve him in his final days. They do not show the truth, because the truth is too human. Too frail. In his last months, Henry became the living embodiment of mortality, a man encased in velvet and jewels, yet ravaged from within. And those around him, trapped in a system built on fear and appearance, could do nothing but pretend. Pretend he was still powerful. Pretend he was still wise. Pretend that the coughing fits, the outbursts, the soiled linens, the infected legs splitting open again and again were all just temporary inconveniences. Pretend that the king could not die, because if he did, what else in their world could fall apart? But he did die, and with his death came a reckoning, not only for the nation he left behind, but for the myth of divine kingship itself. Henry VIII had ruled as if he were untouchable, defying Rome, reshaping a nation's faith, eliminating wives and enemies like pieces on a chessboard. He rewrote laws, manipulated doctrine, and placed himself at the center of an empire of control. Yet in the end, nature reclaimed him. The rot, the fever, the delusion, they stripped him of every illusion of power. And this is perhaps the deepest lesson in his story, that absolute power cannot rewrite the rules of flesh and time, that no throne, no crown, no decree can halt the slow, merciless unraveling of the body. The very institution Henry used to shield himself became his gilded coffin. His court, once vibrant with celebration and art and music, turned into a mausoleum where no one dared speak of death while death laughed, creeping through his veins. And still, even now, we speak his name. We tell his story, but not just because of his political legacy, though that was immense. Not just because of his wives, though their fates captivate us still. No, we tell his story because it reveals something universal, something uncomfortable, something we often try to forget, that no matter how mighty we become, no matter how much history we bend, no matter how many titles we wear, the end waits. Quiet, slow, and indifferent to our crowns, the death of Henry VIII is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a mirror, a grotesque, unflinching mirror held up to the faces of the powerful and to all of us. It asks, when all the armor is gone, when the perfume fades, when the portrait cracks and the dogs come sniffing, what remains? Just flesh, just silence, just the truth. And so, with that final breath, the myth collapsed. The grand fad, maintained through fear, wealth, blood, and spectacle, dissolved into the same dust that awaits us all. No more decrees, no more executions, no more royal processions or whispered plots in the corridors of power. What remained was a story once steeped in contradiction. A prince born in beauty, consumed by ambition, and undone by his own decaying body. A ruler who defied the Pope and claimed the throne of a new church, yet died in terror of divine judgment. A man who rewrote the rules of marriage and monarchy, only to be outlived and overshadowed by the very women he tried to control. We remember Henry for what he built and what he broke. For the birth of the Church of England. For the blood of Anne Boleyn. For the fragile child king who couldn't bear the weight of his father's legacy. But more than that, we remember him because his ending forces us to look inward, to question our obsession with legacy, with image, with invincibility. Henry VIII became a symbol not of triumph, but of the price paid for unchecked power and unacknowledged pain, because beneath the robes and crowns, there was always just a man, one who hurt, one who feared, one who, despite commanding armies, rewriting laws, and changing the course of a nation, could not escape the slow, humiliating descent into darkness. The ulcer that wouldn't heal, the breath that rattled, the ghosts that visited him at night, and the dogs in the chapel, licking the last of his dignity from the stone floor. That image, as disturbing as it may be, lingers because it strips away the fiction. It reminds us that history is not just dates and portraits. It's blood, it's sweat, it's decay. And it is, above all, truth.so. If you've made it this far, ask yourself, what does power mean if it cannot save us from ourselves? What legacy do we leave when our bones are buried beneath layers of silence and spectacle? If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think, feel, question, then don't let it end here. Leave a comment below. What does Henry's fate say to you? Would you want to hear the untold truths behind other rulers, saints, tyrants, or visionaries? Let me know. Your voice shapes the next story, and above all, remember, even kings rot, but stories, they endure. So if you crave more stories that reveal the hidden, the raw, the uncomfortable truths of history, subscribe now, because the past still speaks. You just have to be willing to listen.